Let's dive into the 10 cities facing the most significant pressures in 2025. These aren't just statistics, they're real communities where families are making tough decisions about their futures. Number 10. Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay sits like a sleeping giant on the shores of Lake Superior, but beneath its natural beauty lies a city grappling with some serious challenges. Here's something that might surprise you. This city of just over 100,000 people has one of the highest crime rates in Canada, with violent crime rates nearly double the national average. The real problem started when the forestry and mining industries that built this community began their slow retreat. Mill closures have left entire neighborhoods wondering what comes next. Young people are leaving faster than Tim Hortons runs out of double-doubles on a Monday morning. The population has been shrinking for over a decade, and with it, the tax base that keeps essential services running. But here's what really hits home. Families who've called Thunder Bay home for generations are now questioning whether their children have a future here. The job market has contracted so much that even skilled workers are looking south to Toronto or west to Winnipeg for opportunities. When the youth exodus reaches a tipping point, a city doesn't just lose people, it loses hope. And if you think Thunder Bay's challenges are concerning, wait until you see what's happening to our next city, where an entire economic foundation is crumbling beneath residents' feet. Number 9. Sudbury. Sudbury has always been synonymous with mining, its skyline punctuated by the famous superstack that once symbolized prosperity. But that symbol is now a reminder of an economy that's shifting faster than the Canadian Shield beneath it. Here's a fact that might shock you. Sudbury's economy is still dangerously dependent on a single industry that's becoming increasingly automated. While Vail and Glencore continue operations, they're doing it with fewer and fewer workers. The mining jobs that once supported entire families now require specialized skills that many longtime residents simply don't have. The ripple effect is devastating. When miners lose their jobs, the restaurants they frequented struggle. The car dealerships see fewer customers. The retail stores in the downtown core start closing one by one. It's like watching dominoes fall, except each domino represents someone's livelihood. What makes this particularly heartbreaking is that Sudbury has been trying to diversify for years, investing in technology sectors and education through Laurentian University. But then came the university's financial crisis and restructuring, which cut programs and jobs just when the city needed that diversification most. Families are now caught between an industry that's shrinking and alternative opportunities that haven't materialized fast enough. The question haunting many Sudbury residents isn't just where their next job will come from. It's whether their city can reinvent itself before it's too late. Speaking of reinvention challenges, our next city is facing an identity crisis that goes much deeper than economics. Number 8. Sault Ste. Marie. Sault Ste. Marie sits at one of the most beautiful intersections in North America, where Lake Superior meets Lake Huron, where Canada meets the United States. But geography can't solve the crisis that's been building here for years. The steel industry that built the Soo has been on life support for longer than anyone wants to admit. Algoma Steel's repeated financial troubles have created a cycle of uncertainty that's poisoning the entire local economy. Workers don't know from year to year if their plant will survive, and that uncertainty makes it impossible for other businesses to plan or invest. Here's what's really troubling. The city's population has dropped by over 10% in the last 2 decades. That might sound like just a number, but imagine your neighborhood with 1 in every 10 houses empty. That's the reality many Sault Ste. Marie residents face every day. Empty houses lead to declining property values, which means less tax revenue for the city, which means reduced services, which makes the city less attractive to new residents or businesses. The healthcare system is straining under these pressures too. With fewer young families and more seniors, the demographic balance is tilting in a direction that's financially unsustainable. The local hospital struggles to recruit specialists when there aren't enough patients to justify their presence, creating a medical desert in a region that desperately needs healthcare access. But what's happening in Sault Ste. Marie pales in comparison to the perfect storm brewing in our next city, where multiple crises are converging at exactly the wrong time. Number 7, North Bay. North Bay was once the transportation hub of northern Ontario, the place where highways and railways converged to move goods and people across the vast Canadian landscape. That strategic advantage is now working against it in ways nobody saw coming. The Canadian Forces Base North Bay, which employed thousands and anchored the local economy, has seen its role diminished as military priorities shift. While it's still operational, the uncertainty around future federal defense spending has created anxiety in a community that's heavily dependent on government employment. Here's something that illustrates the depth of the challenge. North Bay's downtown core has a vacancy rate that would make commercial real estate investors weep. Storefronts that once bustled with activity now display for lease signs like a permanent art installation. When the economic center of a city starts hollowing out, it creates a psychological impact that goes beyond just business metrics. The population drain is particularly brutal among young professionals. North Bay has excellent educational institutions and training programs, but graduates consistently leave for opportunities in larger centers. The city has become an educational exporter. It trains talent that builds careers elsewhere. Healthcare recruitment has become nearly impossible. Specialists don't want to practice in a community they perceive as declining, which creates a healthcare crisis that makes the city even less attractive to families. It's a vicious cycle that's accelerating with each passing year. What makes North Bay's situation particularly heartbreaking is that many residents remember when it was a thriving, vibrant community. Now they're watching their city slowly fade, wondering if anything can reverse the tide. And that brings us to our next city, where the fading is happening even faster. Number 6, Timmins. Timmins built its reputation on gold, but that golden legacy is becoming a gilded cage. This city in the heart of northern Ontario is discovering that being famous for one thing can be a liability when that thing becomes less valuable or less accessible. The mining industry that created Timmins is still there, but it's changing in ways that don't benefit the local community. Modern mining operations are increasingly automated and require fewer workers. The jobs that remain require specialized technical skills that many long-time residents don't possess, creating a skills gap in their own hometown. Here's a statistic that reveals the depth of the challenge. Timmins has one of the highest rates of interprovincial migration in Ontario, but it's all outbound. People aren't coming to Timmins to build new lives, they're leaving to build lives elsewhere. The city that once attracted fortune seekers from around the world now can't keep its own children. The infrastructure burden is crushing the municipality. Roads, water systems, and municipal buildings built during boom times now require expensive maintenance and updates, but the tax base to support these costs is shrinking. It's like trying to maintain a mansion on a minimum wage salary. The social challenges are equally concerning. When economic opportunities disappear, communities often struggle with increased substance abuse, mental health issues, and family breakdown. Timmins is seeing these patterns emerge, and the support systems needed to address them are stretched thin. But here's what's really concerning about Timmins. It's becoming a case study for what happens when a single industry town doesn't successfully diversify. Other communities are watching closely, because Timmins today could be there tomorrow. And speaking of tomorrow, our next city is facing a tomorrow that looks dramatically different from its past, and not in a good way. Number 5, Kingston. Now here's where things get really interesting and why I told you not to miss this one. Kingston should be thriving. It has Queen's University, one of Canada's most prestigious institutions. It has Royal Military College, training the country's future military leaders. It has a strategic location between Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal. It has beautiful historic architecture and waterfront properties that should make it a magnet for tourism and development. So why is Kingston on this list? because it's facing a hidden crisis that perfectly illustrates how even seemingly successful cities can be vulnerable to rapid change. The first problem is what economists call institutional dependency. Kingston's economy relies heavily on government institutions and the university, which makes it vulnerable to budget cuts and policy changes. When the federal government tightens spending, or when university enrollment patterns shift, Kingston feels it immediately and intensely. Here's the part that should concern everyone. Kingston's housing market has become completely disconnected from local wages. Students and faculty from Queens, along with government workers, have driven housing costs to levels that local service workers and young families simply can't afford. The city is pricing out the very people who make it function day to day. The downtown core, despite its historic charm, struggles with high commercial vacancy rates. Small businesses can't compete with the costs or the changing consumer patterns of a transient student population. Local entrepreneurs find themselves caught between serving a temporary student market that disappears every summer and building sustainable businesses for permanent residents who are increasingly priced out. But here's the really troubling part. Kingston represents a new type of urban decline. It's not the obvious industrial collapse we see in other cities. It's a more subtle erosion where a city becomes economically successful on paper while becoming socially and economically inaccessible to the people who should call it home. The question is whether this quiet crisis will accelerate into something more dramatic, or whether Kingston can find a way to balance institutional success with community sustainability. This brings us to a city where the balance has already been lost, and the consequences are becoming impossible to ignore. Number 4. Sarnia. Sarnia sits on one of the most industrially strategic locations in North America, where the St. Clair River connects Lake Huron to the Detroit River system. That geography created Chemical Valley, a concentration of petrochemical plants that made Sarnia an industrial powerhouse. But that same geography is now creating an environmental and economic time bomb. The petrochemical industry is facing unprecedented pressure from environmental regulations, changing energy markets, and public health concerns. Plants that once provided stable, well-paying jobs are now viewed as liabilities by communities increasingly concerned about air quality and climate change. Here's what makes Sarnia's situation particularly challenging. The city's entire identity and infrastructure are built around an industry that's becoming politically and environmentally unsustainable. Unlike other industrial cities that can diversify into manufacturing or technology, Sarnia's industrial base is so specialized that transition options are extremely limited. The environmental legacy issues are staggering. Decades of industrial activity have left contamination challenges that will take generations and billions of dollars to address. This environmental burden makes economic diversification even more difficult because new industries are reluctant to locate in areas with known contamination issues. The demographic challenges are accelerating. Young families don't want to raise children in an area associated with environmental health risks. Professionals in emerging industries avoid the region entirely. The city is caught in a spiral where environmental concerns drive away the very people and industries needed for economic renewal. The cross-border relationship with Michigan, once a strength, has become complicated by differing environmental standards and economic priorities. What was once seamless cooperation is now a source of regulatory complexity that discourages investment and development. Sarnia represents the challenge facing many industrial communities. How do you transition from an economy built on industries that society is moving away from? The clock is ticking, and our next city shows what happens when time runs out. Number 3. Chatham, Kent. Chatham, Kent should be thriving. It has some of the most fertile agricultural land in Canada, a strategic location in southwestern Ontario, and a diverse economic base that includes manufacturing, agriculture, and energy production. So why is it struggling? The answer lies in a phenomenon that's becoming increasingly common across Ontario: rural-urban decline. Chatham-Kent is too rural to attract urban industries, but too urban to maintain traditional rural economic patterns. It's stuck in an economic no man's land that's becoming harder to escape each year. Agriculture, the traditional backbone of the region, is consolidating into larger, more automated operations that employ fewer people. The small family farms that once supported vibrant rural communities are disappearing, replaced by corporate agricultural operations that generate wealth but not local employment. Manufacturing, which came to the region because of lower labor costs and available land, is now leaving for the same reasons it arrived, seeking even lower costs in other jurisdictions. The automotive parts plants and other manufacturers that provided middle-class jobs are closing or relocating, leaving behind empty industrial buildings and unemployed workers. Here's what's particularly troubling. Chatham-Kent's population is not just declining, it's aging rapidly. Young people leave for education and never return. The median age is increasing faster than almost anywhere else in Ontario, creating a community that's slowly becoming economically unsustainable. The infrastructure challenges are enormous. A municipality designed to serve a larger, younger population now struggles to maintain roads, water systems, and services for a smaller, older population with a diminished tax base. Essential services like healthcare are becoming harder to maintain when there aren't enough taxpayers to support them. The social fabric of the community is fraying. Schools are closing due to declining enrollment. Community organizations struggle to find volunteers among the remaining working-age population. The civic institutions that once held communities together are weakening just when they're needed most. Chatham-Kent represents a warning about what happens when economic transition happens too slowly. While communities debate and plan, demographic and economic forces create their own momentum. And that brings us to a city where momentum has definitely shifted in the wrong direction. Number 2, Windsor. Here's the one you really need to pay attention to because Windsor's collapse would send shockwaves across all of Canada. This city sits directly across from Detroit, and for decades that proximity was its greatest advantage. The automotive industry built Windsor into a prosperous, working-class city where families could achieve middle-class stability with high school educations and strong work ethics. But that same proximity to Detroit is now Windsor's greatest vulnerability. Detroit's decline didn't stop at the international border. It's been spreading across the river like an economic contagion that's impossible to contain. The automotive industry that built Windsor is fundamentally changing. Electric vehicle production requires different skills, different supply chains, and fewer workers overall. The transition isn't just about learning new technologies. It's about accepting that the industry that supported entire generations of families is going to employ far fewer people going forward. Here's what makes Windsor's situation uniquely dangerous. The city's economy is still overwhelmingly dependent on a single industry that's in the middle of the most dramatic transformation in its history. While other cities have had decades to diversify, Windsor is trying to reinvent itself while its primary industry is simultaneously reinventing itself. The cross-border relationship that was once seamless is now complicated by trade disputes, security concerns, and regulatory differences. The easy flow of goods, services, and people that made Windsor prosperous is no longer guaranteed. Each trade disagreement or border policy change sends ripples through the local economy. The social challenges are compounding rapidly. Areas of the city are experiencing the kind of urban decay typically associated with much larger metropolitan areas. Property values in some neighborhoods have collapsed, creating pockets of abandonment that spread like a virus through adjacent areas. But here's the most concerning part. Windsor's decline would have implications far beyond its city limits. It's a major transportation hub, a key crossing point for billions of dollars in trade, and home to critical infrastructure that serves all of eastern Canada. If Windsor fails, the economic impact would be felt from Toronto to Halifax. The question isn't whether Windsor will face challenges, it's whether those challenges will lead to managed transition or uncontrolled collapse. And that brings us to our final city, where uncontrolled collapse might already be underway. Number 1. Oshawa. Oshawa didn't just rely on the automotive industry, it was the automotive industry in Canada. This was Motor City North, the place where General Motors employed generations of families and built a community around the promise of industrial prosperity. That promise has been broken, and the consequences are still unfolding in ways that should terrify anyone who cares about Ontario's economic future. The closure of GM's Oshawa plant wasn't just the loss of a factory, it was the end of an era. Thousands of direct jobs disappeared overnight, but the real impact goes much deeper. Every automotive job supports multiple other jobs in the community. When those paychecks stopped, the ripple effects spread through every sector of the local economy. Here's a statistic that captures the scale of the disaster. Oshawa's unemployment rate spiked to levels not seen since the Great Depression, and while it's technically recovered, the jobs that replaced automotive work pay significantly less and offer far less security. The city has traded middle-class manufacturing jobs for service sector positions that can't support the same standard of living. The housing market tells the story of a community in crisis. Property values have plummeted in some areas as homeowners flee or face foreclosure. Entire neighborhoods that once bustled with activity now show signs of abandonment and neglect. The city is experiencing the kind of urban decay typically associated with Rust Belt American cities. But here's what makes Oshawa's situation truly alarming. It represents the future that could await any Ontario community that depends too heavily on a single industry or employer. The speed and completeness of Oshawa's economic collapse shows how quickly decades of prosperity can disappear when external forces beyond local control decide to change course. The transformation isn't complete yet. Oshawa is fighting to reinvent itself, attracting new industries and diversifying its economic base. But the city it's becoming will be fundamentally different from the city it was, and many residents are still struggling to adapt to that new reality. What's happening in Oshawa is a warning to every community in Ontario about the risks of economic dependency and the speed at which change can devastate entire regions. These 10 cities represent different faces of the same challenge: how communities adapt when the economic foundations they were built on shift or disappear entirely. From Thunder Bay's resource industry decline to Oshawa's automotive collapse, each city shows us what happens when change comes faster than adaptation. What do you think about these cities and their challenges? Are there solutions we haven't considered or other Ontario communities you think should be on this list? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.